The evening began the way all great gatherings begin in houses like the Voss estate, with the careful arrangement of beautiful things. The chandeliers in the grand hall had been fitted with 300 fresh candles, and their light fell across the assembled company in a warm and indiscriminate gold that made everything below it look like something worth looking at. The women had understood the assignment, as women always do at these occasions. Having received the invitation with its formal script and its unspoken instructions, and having spent the weeks between the invitation and the evening translating those instructions into the appropriate, visible statement. Gold was the color of the season. Gold was what the Voss family's annual winter assembly called for, and gold was what the assembled nobility of the Northern Territories had delivered with the enthusiasm of people who have been waiting for an occasion to justify the expense. There were gowns of deep amber and pale champagne and bright burnished copper and soft antique yellow, all of them catching the candlelight in their own particular ways, all of them doing what expensive fabric is designed to do, which is to make the woman wearing it appear as though the light itself has decided to pay her special attention. The hall was full of this light, and full of this gold, and full of the sound of 300 people engaged in the pleasurable business of being seen in the right place at the right time by the right people. Servants moved between the clusters of guests with trays of dark wine and small savory things on folded linen, and the musicians in the gallery above played something that was elegant without being obtrusive, which was exactly the correct calibration for an evening whose primary purpose was conversation and assessment rather than dancing. Lady Cecile Fontaine stood near the east pillar, with her amber gown arranged precisely as she had practiced arranging it in front of her mirror that afternoon, the fabric catching the light from the nearest chandelier in a way that was not accidental. She had arrived at precisely the right moment, which was to say 20 minutes after the doors had opened and the earliest guests had already established themselves, but well before the hour at which arrival begins to communicate indifference to the occasion. She had spent 4 years attending the Voss Winter Assembly, and she understood its rhythms with the expertise of a person who has studied a thing she considers important. She knew that the host, Dorian Voss, Vampire King of the Northern Territories, would descend the main staircase at the first hour and move through the room in a particular pattern, greeting certain people and acknowledging others, and passing a third category by entirely, and that the category into which he placed you was noted by everyone present and remembered until the following year. She had been in the second category for 3 years and had spent considerable effort positioning herself for the first. She adjusted the fall of her sleeve and looked toward the staircase and thought about the things she intended to say when the moment arrived. She did not notice, in the same way that most of the room did not initially notice, the young woman standing near the far west wall beside the long table of refreshments. The woman was wearing white, not the ivory or the cream that might have been a calculated contrast, not the white gold that some of the bolder guests had worn as an interpretation of the evening's color rather than a departure from it, but a plain and simple white, the white of a dress that had been made for practical occasions and had been brought to this one for no better reason than that it was the best dress its owner possessed. It was well made, the dress, but it was not the kind of well made that announces itself. It was the kind of well made that simply does its job without requiring anyone to admire it for doing so. The young woman inside the dress had brown hair that had been put up with the assistance of a few pins and no particular artistry, and gray eyes that were currently directed at the table of refreshments with the focused attention of someone trying to determine which of the items on offer were worth investigating and which were not. Her name was Mara Venn, and she had not been invited to the Voss Winter Assembly in any personal capacity. She had come with her employer, Lady Duvain, whose companion she had been for 8 months, and she had been told to remain near the refreshment table and to be available if Lady Duvain required anything, and to otherwise make herself as unobtrusive as the occasion permitted. She was doing her best to comply with these instructions. She was not, in any visible way, making an effort to be noticed. Mara had been to 3 formal gatherings in her 22 years of living, and she had found all 3 of them approximately equally bewildering, not because she lacked the intelligence to understand what was happening in them, but because what was happening in them seemed to her so thoroughly at odds with the practical requirements of actual human existence that she could not make the 2 things sit comfortably beside each other in her mind at the same time. People at formal gatherings spent enormous amounts of time and money arranging themselves in specific ways, and then spent the entire evening performing the arrangement for other people who were simultaneously performing their own arrangements. And the object of the whole exercise appeared to be the establishment of a hierarchy that everyone already knew and had already established at every previous gathering of the same group, and which would need to be established again at the next one. She understood that there was something she was missing, some value in the exercise that her particular way of looking at things was not equipped to locate, and she was willing to accept this as a limitation of her own perspective rather than a failing of the exercise itself. She was not, as a general rule, dismissive of things she did not understand. She simply put them in the category of things she did not yet understand and continued with the things she did. What she understood this evening was that the smoked fish on the small rounds of dark bread was excellent, and that the pale wine being offered by the nearest servant was not as good as the darker variety she could see on a different tray across the room, and that the pillars in this hall were old and good, genuine stone, rather than the plasterwork imitations she had seen in newer houses, and that the musicians in the gallery above were playing something she recognized from a much simpler version her father had played on a small instrument in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in. She was thinking about this last thing, about the distance between the kitchen version and the chandelier version of the same piece of music, when she became aware that the quality of the sound in the room had changed. It had not become louder or quieter. It had become more directed. The particular ambient sound of 300 people engaged in 300 separate conversations had shifted, incrementally, and all at once, into something that was still the sound of conversation, but was now organized around a central point rather than distributed evenly through the space. She looked toward the staircase. He was descending it. She had not seen Dorian Voss before this evening. She knew his name the way anyone in the Northern Territories knew his name, which was to say completely, and from early childhood. The way you know the name of a mountain or a river, as a feature of the landscape that has always been there, and whose specific details you have never had occasion to investigate personally. What she had not known, because it was not the kind of thing that was communicated by a name, was the particular quality of his presence in a room. He was tall and dark-haired, and pale and severe in the way that she had heard described by people who had seen him before, but the description had not communicated the specific and slightly disconcerting fact that he moved through a room of 300 people, as though the room contained no obstacles worth navigating around. Not because he was arrogant, or not only because of that, but because he had the precise and unhurried movement of a person who knows exactly where they are going and has already determined that nothing between their current position and their destination is going to alter either the direction or the pace. He reached the floor of the hall, and the room reorganized itself around him in the subtle and entirely involuntary way that rooms reorganize around certain kinds of people, and he began to move through the guests in the pattern that Lady Cecile Fontaine, had she been watching him instead of composing herself near the east pillar, would have recognized as his established route. The route of a man who has done this particular thing many times before and has long since determined the most efficient path through it. He greeted Lord Auerbach near the main doors and spoke briefly with the elder Fontaine at the fireplace and acknowledged the cluster of district officials near the center of the room, with a nod that communicated the precise degree of recognition appropriate to their position. And then something in the established pattern of his movement changed. He stopped. It was not a dramatic stop, not the kind that draws gasps or causes the people nearest to him to step back. It was a small and entirely internal interruption of momentum, the kind that would be invisible to anyone not paying close attention to the specific quality of how he moved, which Mara was not doing, because she had no reason to pay close attention to how he moved, and was, in fact. At the precise moment that he stopped, looking back at the refreshment table and reconsidering the smoked fish. She did not know he had stopped. She did not know that what had interrupted his momentum was a sightline across the crowded and golden room that had landed, unexpectedly and with some force, on the figure in plain white standing near the west wall, with a small round of dark bread and smoked fish in one hand, and a glass of the darker wine she had managed to acquire in the other, and an expression of genuine and entirely unperformed contentment on her face. She did not know any of this because she was thinking about the fish, and about her father's kitchen, and about the distance between simple and elaborate versions of the same underlying thing, which was a thought she found more interesting than most of the thoughts available to her at formal gatherings of this kind. Dorian Voss, who had attended his own winter assembly for 9 consecutive years and had never once stopped moving through it in the middle of his established route for any reason that was not a direct request from a person who required his attention, stood still for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in a room of that kind, at an occasion of that kind, is a perceptible duration. The people nearest to him noticed it in the peripheral way that people notice disruptions to expected patterns, without being entirely sure what they have noticed, or whether they have noticed anything at all. Lady Cecile Fontaine, who had been watching the room with the specific attention of a woman preparing for a particular moment, noticed it with rather more precision. She followed the line of his stopped attention across the room, and found, with a sensation she would later describe to her mother as being something like stepping onto a stair that was not there, the young woman in the plain white dress near the west wall. She looked at the young woman for a moment with the comprehensive assessment of a person who has spent years developing the skill of comprehensive assessment, and she found nothing that explained what she was looking at. The young woman was not beautiful in the way that the assembled company understood beauty, which was to say arranged and presented and performing the performance of beauty for an audience. She was simply a person standing near a table of refreshments in a white dress, eating smoked fish, with the composed satisfaction of someone who has found something good and is paying it proper attention. There was nothing about her that was designed to attract notice. She attracted notice anyway, or rather, she attracted the notice of one specific person in the room, and that specific person was the one whose notice mattered most to everyone else present, and this fact rippled through the sections of the room that had observed it with the quiet efficiency of a fact that everyone has understood, and no one is yet ready to say out loud. Dorian Voss resumed moving. He did not resume moving in the direction of the next point on his established route. He moved toward the west wall. Lady Cecile watched him cross the room. She watched the guests nearest to him register his change of direction and process it and exchange small significant looks with the people beside them. She watched the space near the west wall and the young woman in the plain white dress, who was still, as far as anyone could determine, primarily interested in the refreshment table, and entirely unaware that the Vampire King of the Northern Territories was moving through a room of 300 formally dressed people in order to stand beside her. He stopped 2 feet away from the young woman. He looked at her. She had not yet looked at him. She was looking at the table, where she appeared to be deciding between 2 additional items, with the serious deliberation of a person who does not make decisions carelessly. Then she looked up, because the quality of the space beside her had changed in a way that was difficult to ignore even for a person who was paying primary attention to a table of food, and she found him looking at her with the dark and entirely steady eyes that were, up close, considerably more significant than they appeared from across a room. She did not produce any of the reactions that the watching room might have expected. She did not flush, or startle, or arrange her expression into any of the available shapes that young women arrange their expressions into when a powerful and significant person directs his attention at them suddenly and at close range. She looked at him with the same gray-eyed directness she would have brought to any person who had appeared unexpectedly beside her, which was to say the directness of someone who finds other people genuinely interesting rather than strategically useful, and is accordingly willing to look at them without a great deal of preparation. She said, "Good evening." He said, "Good evening," she said. "You are Lord Voss." It was not a question, and it was not flattery. It was simply a statement of recognition, the way you state a fact when you are sure of it, and see no reason to frame it as anything other than what it is. He said, "Yes." She said, "This is a very good assembly." He looked at her for a moment, and the room, which had been watching the exchange with the compressed attention of 300 people trying to hear a conversation across a distance that was slightly too large to hear across, strained collectively toward them by some small unconscious degree. He said, "I am told it is." She considered this response for a moment, tilting her head slightly in the manner of someone filing something away for later examination. She said, "You do not enjoy it yourself." It was not a question either. He said, "I find it useful." She said, "That is a very honest thing to say." He said, "I generally find honesty more efficient than the alternative." She looked at him with the specific attention of someone who has heard something that interests them. She said, "That is also honest." A thing that could be described as an almost smile passed across the severe arrangement of his face and vanished before it had fully assembled itself. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "My name is Mara Venn. I came with Lady Duvain, whose household I am part of." He looked at her white dress, and at the glass of dark wine, and at the small round of bread in her other hand, and at her face, taking in the full picture with the calm efficiency of a man who is used to assessing situations quickly and accurately. He said, "You are not a guest." She said, "Not in the official sense, no." He said, "And yet you are drinking the better wine." She said, "The better wine was on the other tray. I saw it when I came in, and I made a point of getting to it before the tray moved." He looked at her. She looked back. She was not performing composure. She was simply composed, in the way that people are composed when they are not spending any of their available resources on managing the impression they are making, which left all of those resources available for the actual conversation. And the actual conversation, brief as it had been, was the most interesting one he had conducted at his own assembly in 9 years of conducting them. He said, "Will you walk with me?" It was a question, which was not what she had expected. She had expected, to the extent that she had expected anything, that the conversation would end in the natural way of conversations at formal gatherings, which was with the person of higher social position moving on to the next person of higher social position, and the person of lower position returning to their previous occupation. She had not expected to be asked a question that required a real answer. She considered the question with the honest deliberation she brought to real questions. She looked at Lady Duvain's distant figure across the room, engaged in animated conversation near the fireplace, with 2 other women of similar vintage and similar enthusiasm for conversation, and she concluded that Lady Duvain was not going to require anything from her companion for at least the next 20 minutes. She said, "Yes." They walked along the north gallery that ran above the hall, which was quieter than the room below, and lined with the tall, narrow windows that looked out over the estate's winter landscape, all dark tree lines and pale fields under the clear February sky. The sounds of the assembly reached them from below, but softened and made distant by the stone floor between the gallery and the hall, reduced to something that was present, but not intrusive. Mara walked beside him, and she did not fill the silence with the kind of conversation that people fill silences with at formal gatherings, the observations about the assembly and the weather, and the other guests that function as sound rather than as communication. She was quiet in the easy way of someone who finds silence comfortable rather than threatening. And this was, he noticed, a quality that was considerably rarer than it ought to be among people of any class or position. He said, "How long have you been with Lady Duvain?" She said, 8. Months, he said. And before that, she said, I was with my father in the Southern Valley. He died in the spring and I needed a position, and Lady Duvane's household was the position that was available. He said, I am sorry about your father. She said, thank you. He was a practical man. He would have thought it was a reasonable situation. She said it without any of the performance of grief that people bring to mentions of recent loss in formal conversations, not because she did not grieve him, but because she had already done the private work of grieving him and did not need to do it additionally in front of a stranger. He looked at her profile as they walked, at the clean line of her jaw and the way she looked at the windows as they passed them, with an attention that was genuine rather than decorative. He said, What did your father do? She said, He kept accounts for the merchants in the valley town. He taught me to read contracts before he taught me anything else, because he believed that the ability to find what a document is actually saying, beneath what it appears to be saying, was the most useful skill a person could have. He said, That is an unusual belief for a merchant's accountant. She said, He was an unusual accountant. He paused over some disagreement among the merchants about a warehouse lease when I was 14, and he asked me to read the lease and tell him where the problem was. I found it in 40 minutes. He never looked at a contract again, without first asking me to read it. He stopped at the window at the far end of the gallery and looked out at the dark fields. The candlelight from the assembly hall below cast a faint warm light through the gallery floor in thin lines between the stones, and Mara stood beside him at the window and looked out at the same landscape and thought that winter fields at night had a specific quality of stillness that she had always found clarifying rather than bleak. She did not say this. She had not yet determined whether it was the kind of thing that belonged in this particular conversation. He said, And what did you find in the lease? She said, The merchant who had written it had included a clause that gave him the right to renegotiate the storage rate at any interval he chose, provided he gave notice in writing. The notice period was defined elsewhere in the document as 7 days. 7 days is not enough time to move the contents of a warehouse. He effectively had the right to raise the rate to anything he wanted without meaningful consequence, because the alternative to paying the new rate was logistically impossible in the time allowed. He turned to look at her. He said, How old were you? She said, 14, he said. And your father? She said, He had been looking at the lease for 3 days. He was a very intelligent man. He just looked at things directly, and this particular thing required looking at it indirectly to find the mechanism. He said, How do you learn to look at things indirectly? She said, I am not sure it is something you learn. I think it is something you are. Or you are not. You either have the instinct for the thing that is hidden, or you see only the thing that is shown. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Which do you prefer? She looked at him. She said, Which do I prefer about myself? He said, Yes, she said, I prefer it. It is frequently inconvenient, because you see things that would be easier not to see, but I prefer it to the alternative. Below them in the hall, the evening continued in its established pattern. Lady Cecile Fontaine had recovered her composure and redirected her attention to Lord Aldrich Fenmore, who was an acceptable alternative and who seemed genuinely interested in the arrangement of her sleeve in the candlelight, which was at least a concrete and manageable outcome from an evening that had otherwise not developed as she had planned. Lady Duvane, near the fireplace, had consumed enough of the darker wine to reach the particular stage of her evenings at which all conversation became equally interesting and equally inexhaustible, which meant she was likely to remain contentedly occupied until the servants began collecting the empty glasses and the musicians in the gallery above indicated through a change in tempo that the assembly was concluding. No one had come to find Mara at the refreshment table. No one had noticed that she was not at it. Mara was aware of none of this, because she was in the North Gallery talking to Dorian Voss about honesty and indirection and the specific skill of locating the thing that a document or a person is trying not to show you. And the conversation had the quality that very few conversations have, which is the quality of being about something real and proceeding further into the real thing with each exchange, rather than moving laterally across its surface without ever getting any closer to it. He said, "You mentioned that the skill is inconvenient." She said, "Yes." He said, "Give me an example." She considered this for a moment, and then she said, "Lady Devane." He said, "Go on." She said, "She is a kind woman. She is genuinely kind, not performatively kind. When she was told her companion of 12 years had left her position to be married, she cried for 2 days, and she did not cry where anyone could see her because she was embarrassed by how much she had cared. I know this because I heard her, once through a door she did not know was thin." He said, "That is kind." She said, "Yes." She paused. She said, "She also invited me into her household 8 months ago as a companion, and it took me approximately 6 weeks to understand that what she wanted was not a companion in the functional sense, but someone to carry the weight of certain specific fears that she did not want to carry alone. The fear of rooms that are too quiet, the fear of mornings that arrive without any purpose attached to them, the fear of being a person who has become primarily historical, whose significance is located in what she was rather than in what she is now." She said, "I am useful to her. I keep the rooms from being too quiet. I give the mornings a shape. I am not unkind about it, but I see it clearly, and seeing it clearly means I can never not see it, which means the relationship is a different thing to me than it is to her." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you prefer to see things as they are or as they appear?" She said, "That is not a real choice. You cannot prefer to see only the surface of things once you have developed the habit of seeing through them." He said, "No. I mean, given the weight of what clear seeing costs, do you value it?" She thought about this for longer than she had thought about anything else he had asked her. She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because the alternative is not innocence. The alternative to seeing clearly is not being protected from difficult things. The alternative is being confused by them. Confusion is much worse than clarity, even when the clear thing is hard." He looked at her for a long time in the quiet of the North Gallery, with the sounds of the assembly drifting up from the hall below them and the dark winter landscape visible through the tall windows. He said, "You are not what I expected to find this evening." She said, "What did you expect to find?" He said, "The usual assembly." She said, "It is the usual assembly." He said, "It was." He walked her back down to the hall at the end of the first hour, which was when his protocol required him to be visible again to the assembled company. He did not offer her his arm in the formal way, because she was not a guest in the formal sense, and offering it would have been a public statement that he had not yet decided to make publicly. He simply walked beside her at the pace she set, which was a moderate and unhurried pace. The pace of someone who has no particular reason to arrive anywhere quickly. She noticed the not offered arm, and understood it and found it, on balance, more respectful than the offered one would have been, because the offered arm in that context would have been a performance for the watching room, rather than a gesture toward her. She was becoming aware. A person who noticed these things about him very quickly, which was either a function of her general tendency to see clearly, or something more specific to him. She had not yet determined which. What she had determined, in the hour in the North Gallery, was that he was not what she had expected him to be either. She had expected, on the basis of everything she had ever heard about him, a person of considerable power who wore that power the way certain people wear expensive clothing, with the comfortable assumption that it is the most interesting thing about them and the thing that should orient the attention of everyone they encounter. What she had found was a person who wore his power the way you wear an old coat that fits well, as a practical thing, rather than a statement, something that does what it is supposed to do, and does not require comment. He was precise where she had expected to find performance. He was direct where she had expected to find management. He was, underneath the severity of his face and the controlled quality of his movement, a person who was tired of the surface of things and had been tired of it for a long time, and who had encountered this evening, without looking for it, something that was not a surface at all. They reached the main floor of the hall. The room reorganized itself around his return the way it had reorganized when he descended the staircase, registering his presence and his direction with the peripheral attention that the assembled company brought to everything he did. He stopped. He said, quietly and without any performance of significance, "You will be at the assembly for the remainder of the evening." She said, "Until Lady Duvain is ready to leave." He said, "Then I will find you again before the evening ends." She looked at him. She said, "There are 300 people here who have been waiting for you to find them all year." He said, "I know," she said. And he said, "And I have already spent the better part of an hour with you, which is longer than I have spent with any single person at this assembly in 9 years of hosting it." She considered this. She said, "That is a significant thing to say." He said, "I generally find honesty more efficient than the alternative." She almost smiled. He saw the almost smile, which was not a fully assembled thing, but a movement at the corner of her mouth that her habitual composure had not quite contained, and he noted it with the specific attention of someone who has found something worth finding, and intends to remember exactly where they found it. He said, "Enjoy the rest of the evening." He returned to his assembly. He moved through the room in his established pattern, greeting the people who required greeting, and acknowledging the people who required acknowledging, and the room received him with the warm and slightly relieved attention of a gathering that had been waiting for the occasion to proceed normally, and was glad to see it doing so. But twice, in the next hour, he stopped briefly in his movement through the room and looked toward the west wall, and both times he found what he was looking for, which was a young woman in plain white standing near the long table of refreshments, talking now with one of the younger servants about something that appeared to be making both of them genuinely interested, and looking, in all the gold and arrangement and performance of the assembled northern nobility, like the only person in the room who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Lady Duvain found Mara at the end of the second hour, flushed with wine and good conversation, and the particular satisfying tiredness of a woman who has spent an evening in her best element. She took Mara's arm and said, "There you are. I have been talking to Marchioness Aldine about the Southern water rights dispute, and it is considerably more interesting than it sounds." Mara said, "Most things are." Lady Duvain looked at her with the slightly unfocused affection of someone who is comfortable and a little warm from wine, and glad to have her companion back in her vicinity where she belongs. She said, "Were you bored?" Mara said. "No." Lady Duvain said, "You should have come to find me." Mara said, "You seemed fully occupied." Lady Duvain laughed at this in the easy way of someone who finds the accurate observation of their own behavior charming rather than intrusive, which was one of the things that made her genuinely likable. She said, "Well, we should begin to think about the carriage. Not yet, but soon." Mara said, "Yes." Lady Duvain moved off to conclude her conversation with the Marchioness, and Mara turned back to the room. She was aware, in the way she had been aware of it intermittently since they had come back down to the hall, that Dorian Voss had looked in her direction twice in the past hour. She was aware of it the way she was aware of most things that she had noticed and catalogued, and was not yet ready to draw conclusions about, which was to say quietly, and without assigning it any more weight than the available evidence warranted. She was also aware, and this one was less easy to set aside with the careful neutrality she applied to most things, that the hour in the North Gallery had been the most interesting conversation she had had with any person in the 8 months since her father died. This was not a complicated observation. She was not trying to make it complicated. Her father had been the person she talked to, really talk to, in the way that requires the other person to be genuinely present rather than socially functional. And after he died, there had not been another person of that kind available to her. Lady Duvain was kind, and she was good company, and she was someone Mara felt real affection for, but she was not a person who wanted to talk about the distance between the surface of things and the thing underneath the surface. She wanted to talk about the surface, beautifully and with genuine enthusiasm, and Mara had learned to do that with her, and to value it for what it was, rather than resenting it for what it was not. But she had not, until this evening, stood in a north gallery and talked with someone about what it costs to see clearly, and had the person across from her understand completely what she meant and add something true to it. And she was finding now that she needed a moment to simply hold this fact before she put it in the appropriate category and moved on with the evening. A servant appeared at her elbow with a tray. She looked at it. The darker wine. She took a glass, because she had earned it, and she looked across the room at the assembly that was beginning its slow movement toward conclusion. Guests starting the complex social choreography of the departure, the gathering of wraps and the exchange of last significant words, and the strategic timing of exits. She found him across the room without particularly looking for him, which was a thing she noted and did not yet draw a conclusion from. He was speaking with Lord Auerbach, and his attention was where it should be, on the conversation in front of him. But as she watched, he looked up, with the directness of a person who knows exactly where to look, and he found her across the full width of the crowded hall, and what passed between them in that single exchange of attention was not a performance, and not a communication for any audience. It was simply two people who had found something in an unexpected place, acknowledging the finding. She held the gaze for a moment, and then she looked away, back to the room, and the guests, and the assembly that was concluding all around her. She was a practical person. She held her wine glass, and she thought about practical things, about the carriage, and the cold night road, and the hour back to Lady Duvain's house, and the morning that would come after. She was a practical person, and she thought about practical things, and she did not think about the North Gallery, and she was only partially successful at not thinking about it, which she noted without judgment, and filed away as information. He found her 20 minutes before the assembly ended, as he had said he would, because he did not say things he did not intend to do. He found her near the south entrance, where Lady Duvain had established herself to conduct her final conversations of the evening, with the efficiency of a woman who knows exactly how to make a departure productive, rather than simply conclusive. He approached in the direct way he did everything, not performing the approach or softening it with any social intermediary, and Lady Duvain saw him coming before Mara did, and produced an expression that contained several things at once: surprise, assessment, a rapid revision of several assumptions, and the visible effort to compose all of these into something appropriate to the occasion. He said, Lady Duvain. She said, Lord Voss. Her voice was entirely correct, which was a credit to 30 years of social practice. He said, your companion was kind enough to walk with me in the gallery this evening. I wanted to express appreciation for her time. Lady Duvain looked at Mara. Mara looked at Lady Duvain. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Lady Duvain said, of course, Mara is very good company. He said, she is. He turned to Mara. He said, I would like to call on Lady Duvain's household at a time that is convenient, to discuss the matter we were speaking of this evening. She looked at him. The matter they had been speaking of this evening did not have an obvious practical extension that would warrant a formal call, and they both knew this. She said, what matter specifically? He said, the management of the estate's southern contracts. There are discrepancies in the warehouse lease records for this season that I have not been able to resolve. She held his gaze for a moment with the gray-eyed directness that she brought to all real things. She said, what kind of discrepancies? He said, the kind that are easier to find if you know where not to look directly. She understood what he meant immediately, because she had been the person who had told him what that meant, which was the point. She said, "I am available on Thursday mornings between 8 and 11. He said, "I will come Thursday." Lady Duvain, who had been listening to this exchange with the complete and focused attention of a woman who had attended enough of these gatherings over enough years to understand that something significant had just happened in the register of a business conversation, said nothing until he had moved away to conduct the remaining business of closing the assembly. Then she turned to Mara and said, "The warehouse leases." Mara said, "Yes," Lady Duvain said. "He owns 12 warehouses along the southern route." Mara said, "Yes," Lady Duvain said. "He has a team of solicitors who manage those contracts." Mara said, "I know." Lady Duvain looked at her for a long and thoughtful moment. She said, "Thursday between 8 and 11. Mara said, "Yes." Lady Duvain picked up her wrap from the servant who was holding it and said, "We should get the carriage." The night air outside the assembly hall was cold and clear, and the stars above the Voss estate were the specific sharp stars of winter at altitude, the kind that appear only when the sky is completely without cloud and the air holds nothing between you and the distance. Mara stood outside the hall while the carriage was brought around, and she looked up at the stars with the composed attention she brought to everything that was genuinely worth looking at, and she thought about warehouse leases and discrepancies in contract records, and the particular mechanism of locating the thing that is hidden by looking somewhere other than directly at it. And she thought about Thursday between 8 and 11, and she thought about nothing else. Thursday came with a pale frost on the ground and a sky the color of iron, which was the color that the northern sky wore most often in February, and which Mara had come to find, over 8 months of living under it. Not unfriendly, but simply honest about what the season was and what it required from the people inside it. She arrived in the main receiving room of Lady Duvain's house at 8 o'clock precisely, which was her established arrival time for all things she took seriously, with the set of tools she used for contract work laid out on the table. These were not elaborate tools. They were a good pen, and a pot of ink, and a clean sheet of paper for notes, and the particular quality of patient attention that was, as she had told him in the gallery, either something you had or something you did not. Lady Duvain had found reasons to be elsewhere in the house between 8 and 11, which was a courtesy that Mara noted and was grateful for, without making any occasion of it. He arrived at 8 minutes past 8, which was close enough to punctuality to communicate that he had made a real effort, and that other things had slightly intervened, both of which were true. He brought 3 ledger books and a folder of loose papers. He set them on the table, and he looked at her arrangement of tools and at her expression, and he said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning," he said. "I should tell you that the warehouse lease issue is real." She said, "I assumed it was." He said, "I should also tell you that it is not the only reason I am here." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "I know." He said, "I wanted to be honest about both things." She said, "I know that too." She pulled the first ledger toward her and opened it to the relevant section. She said, "Tell me what you know about the discrepancy, and I will tell you where to look for the mechanism." He told her clearly and without any excess of detail, the way a person tells a thing when they have prepared what they need to say before they arrive. She listened with the quality of attention she brought to all real things, which was complete and without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are looking at the delivery records." He said, "Yes." She said, "The problem is not in the delivery records." He said, "Where is it?" She said, "It is in the inspection records from the previous season." Someone altered the baseline condition rating of the warehouse before the current lease was written, which means the current tenant is liable for damages that existed before he took possession. He said, "How long would it take you to find the alteration?" She said, "Show me the inspection records." He found them in the folder of loose papers and set them in front of her, and she looked at them with the focused and particular attention she had described to him in the gallery, the attention that goes sideways to a thing rather than directly at it. She found the alteration in 11 minutes, not because she was looking for exactly that thing, but because she had looked at the surrounding things the alteration needed to support itself and found that they did not quite support it. The way a repaired wall section can be identified, not by the repair itself, but by the slight inconsistency in the weathering pattern of the stones immediately around it. She showed him where to look. He looked. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "The same legal firm that wrote the lease." She said, "Yes," he said. "They altered their own records." She said, "They altered a copy of their own records. The original inspection document will be in the property archive with the county surveyor. The dates will not match." He looked at her across the table and its spread of papers with the specific expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one that meant he had registered something significant and was determining exactly how to respond to it. He said, "How did you learn to do this?" She said, "I told you." He said, "Your father taught you to read contracts." She said, "He taught me the skill, the particular application of looking sideways at a thing rather than directly, is something I found myself, over time. Because things that are hidden in predictable ways, and once you understand the ways they hide themselves, the hiding becomes the thing you look for, rather than the thing you are looking at." They worked through the morning with the focused and easy efficiency of two people who approach problems in compatible ways, and have the good sense to recognize it when they find it. The warehouse lease was, as she had suspected, a simpler problem than it looked from the wrong direction, and a more significant one than anyone had noticed, because they had been looking at it from the wrong direction. By 10 o'clock they had identified 3 separate instances of record alteration by the same legal firm across 2 different properties, and the picture this produced was not a complicated one. It was a firm that had been doing a specific and profitable thing for several years, and had never been caught because no one had thought to look at the inspection records before the lease records, and had, consequently, never noticed that the former were being altered to make the latter appear legitimate. He said, "I need to contact the county surveyor's office and request the original inspection documents for formal comparison." She said, "Yes," he said. "This will take time to resolve through the appropriate legal process." She said, "Yes," he said. "In the meantime, the current tenant is paying for damages he did not cause." She said, "That is a problem that can be addressed now, before the formal resolution, if you choose to address it." He said, "How?" she said. "Write to the tenant. Tell him you are conducting a review of the relevant records and that his lease payments are paused until the review is complete. Give him no further detail at this stage. He will not know what the review concerns and will interpret it in whatever way his own conscience directs, which is informative in itself." He looked at her. He said, "That is the kind of thing that looks simple and is not simple at all." She said, "Most useful things are." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers on the table between them with the expression of a man who has just resolved something and found the resolution unexpectedly complete. Then he looked up at her and he said, "I want to ask you something that is not about the leases." She said, "Yes," he said, "what you are doing at Lady Duvane's." She said, "I told you." He said, "You told me the functional description." He paused. He said, "I mean what you are doing there, as opposed to somewhere that would make better use of what you can do." She considered this. She said, "Lady Duvane needed someone, and I needed a position." He said, "And now?" She said, "And now, I have a position." He said, "That is not what I asked." She looked at him across the table and its papers with the gray-eyed directness that she had brought to everything from the first moment of their conversation in the hall, and she said, "I am aware that the position is not permanent in the sense that positions are permanent." She paused. She said, "Lady Duvain will marry again. She is too fond of company to remain without it for long, and when she does, her household will reorganize around the new arrangement, and a companion will be less necessary than she currently is." He said, "That is a clear-eyed view of the situation." She said, "I told you I prefer clarity." He said, "What will you do when that time comes?" She said, "I have not decided." He said, "I have several properties that require the kind of attention you have been providing this morning." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "That is a very careful way to say a thing." He said, "I am a very careful person." She said, "I know." He had said in the North Gallery that he generally found honesty more efficient than the alternative. She had found this to be true across the entire morning. She had also found, across the entire morning, that the quality of his attention did not diminish over time, which was the thing she had found rarest in any person in all the years she had been paying attention to how people paid attention. Most people were present for an hour and then gradually elsewhere. He was simply and consistently present, in the plain and entirely unperformed way of someone for whom presence is not an effort. She said, "I will consider it." He said, "That is all I am asking for at this stage." She said, "That is not quite all you are asking for at this stage." He almost smiled, the specific and genuine almost smile she had first seen in the hall when she had said the assembly was very good. He said, "No, it is not quite all." Spring reached the northern territories slowly, the way it always reached high country, arguing with winter every step of the way. Mara noticed it first in the quality of the morning light, which by the time 3 months had passed from the evening of the winter assembly, had changed from the flat iron gray of deep winter to something that carried, on certain mornings, a sharper and more particular quality. Something that had made a decision about itself. She noticed it from the window of the room she was working in at the Voss estate, which had been her primary working location on Thursday mornings since January, and had, by degrees that were gradual enough to be almost invisible and significant enough to be unmistakable, begun to expand its hours. The Thursday mornings had become Thursday mornings and Thursday afternoons, and then Thursday mornings and Thursday afternoons and occasional other mornings when a specific matter required her attention, and then, by the end of February, a working arrangement that had been given a formal structure and a formal title, at Lady Duvain's practical and entirely unsurprised suggestion. Because Lady Duvain was a perceptive woman who paid close attention to things that mattered to her, and had paid close attention to the expression on Mara's face on the Thursday evenings when she came home. The working arrangement was with the estate's legal and contracts department, nominally, and in practice, it was with Dorian Voss directly, because the contract discrepancies she had found in January had led to the discovery of 3 additional areas of irregular practice in the estate's southern property management, and the investigation of these areas required the kind of sustained and sideways attention that she had, and that the estate's existing legal team, who were capable and thorough people, were not constitutionally equipped to provide. She was good at the work. She had always been good at it. The difference was that she was now doing it in a place that was large enough for the full extent of what she was good at to have room, and the experience of this was, she found, quietly significant, in a way that she did not try to make smaller than it was. He appeared in the doorway of the working room on the morning the light changed, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside the papers she was working through. He looked at the window. He said, "The spring is coming." She said, "Yes," he said, "there is a matter in the Eastern Valley that I need to look at in person today. I want you to come." She looked at the papers on the table, and at the cup of tea, and at him in the doorway. She said, "What kind of matter?" He said, "A road maintenance contract with a clause in it that the local contractor is interpreting in a way that I believe is not the intended interpretation, but that I cannot disprove without a second set of eyes on the original language." She said, "What does the clause say?" he said. It says that the contractor is responsible for maintenance of all road surfaces within the designated route to a standard of safe passage for normal commercial traffic. She said, and he is interpreting normal commercial traffic as excluding the heaviest vehicles. He said, yes. She said, which is wrong. He said, I believe it is wrong. She said, it is wrong. Normal commercial traffic in any road maintenance contract written in this region in the last 30 years refers to the full range of commercial vehicles licensed for use on public roads, which includes the heaviest freight carriers. The exclusion of any licensed category requires explicit language. If the clause does not contain explicit exclusion language, the exclusion does not exist. He looked at her across the room. He said, I know. She said, then why do you need a second set of eyes? He was quiet for a moment. The morning light through the east window had the specific and changed quality she had noticed earlier, the quality of a season that has decided to arrive. He said, I do not need a second set of eyes on the contract. She looked at him. He looked back. He said, the Eastern Valley is 12 miles from here, and the road runs through the old forest, which is worth seeing in the early spring. I thought you might like to see it. She held his gaze for a moment, with the directness she brought to all real things, and in the quiet of the working room, with the spring light coming through the window and the tea warm beside the papers on the table, she smiled. It was not an almost smile. It was a real one, unhurried and entirely genuine, the smile of a person who has found something she was not looking for and found it good. She said, I will get my coat. He said, I will have the horses brought. The Eastern Valley was 12 miles away, and the road ran through the old forest, and the spring was arriving in the way that real things arrive, without announcement and without performance, simply becoming true.